Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Ed Fuller, the president of the Heritage Foundation. On behalf of my colleagues on the board and the staff of the Heritage Foundation, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to our Landon Auditorium today. A very interesting and timely presentation on the battle for school choice, an issue which has been of central concern to all of us at Heritage for many years, and which is increasingly now moving to the state level, and which increasingly concerns policymakers on both sides of the aisle, not only here in Washington, but in the state capitals as well. We have an extraordinarily appropriate speaker to address this topic today, and a good friend and colleague of ours at Heritage to introduce our main speaker. The introducer is well known to Heritage audiences. Bill Bennett is a distinguished fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. He also serves as co-director of Empower America, a frequent commentator on Fox News. He was Secretary of Education, drug czar under Presidents Reagan and Bush, head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and has held various other government positions and significant roles, including a past professor at Boston University, where he tells us he was always looking for conservative students. The challenge today seems to be to find conservative professors, because we know there are conservative students. Bill Bennett is the author of more than a dozen books, many of which have appeared on America's bestseller lists. He's a friend of virtue, liberty, and patriotism. And it's my very great pleasure in a second to ask him to come up. But first, any of you who are watching us over the internet on our live feed, if you have questions for Dick DeVos, I will encourage you to send us an email at speaker@heritage.org, and we will include those questions in the Q&A period after our speaker is finished. Now again, it's my very great pleasure to ask Secretary Bill Bennett to come up and introduce our speaker. Bill?
Thank you, Ed. Mr. President, good to be here. Good to be back. Dick DeVos is going to talk to us about what's next and where's next in the education reform movement. And I want to know what's next and where's next, because I want to be there, wherever it is. And I think many here in the audience, Dick, want to be there too. Let me tell you a little about this extraordinary guy, Dick DeVos. He is a noted business leader and a strong advocate for community and educational causes. From 1993 until his retirement, look at this man. This man is retired, okay? In 2002, he served as president of Alticor, Inc., where he was the prime architect of the company's global business strategy. Dick DeVos pioneered the $4.5 billion company's expansion into dozens of markets around the world, a move that made Alticor one of the world's most globally diverse organizations. In 2000, Dick DeVos oversaw a critical corporate restructuring that created Alticor, the new parent company of predecessor Amway Corporation, Access Business Group, and Quickstar, Inc. In September 2002, DeVos was elected to a 3-year term as chairman of the World Federation of Direct Selling Associations. Founded in 1978, the WFDSA is a non-governmental voluntary organization globally representing the direct selling industry. His priorities include strengthening the financial foundation of the organization and improving the reputation of direct selling worldwide. But I know Dick DeVos best for his interest and his passion in education. A former member of the Michigan State Board of Education, he's helped create over 4,000 scholarships for underprivileged students in Michigan to attend the school of their choice. Beyond that focus, Dick DeVos remains active in his community through continued leadership of the Grand Rapids area downtown revitalization and regional healthcare improvement efforts. In 1997, Dick DeVos authored the best-selling book, Rediscovering American Values. Dick DeVos earned a bachelor's degree from Northwood University in Midland, Michigan. Now, apart from this resume, let me just say, for those of you interested in education reform, you can go around and talk to dozens and dozens of business executives, corporate executives who want to, quote, help improve American education. But their way of improving American education is to give more money to the blob, more money to the bureaucracy, run their businesses in a tough-minded way, and then when they get into a meeting with the superintendent or go into a school, they act like they're in church. And they don't want to change anything, they don't want to shake anything up, they don't want anybody to think any new ideas for fear that they will be thought of as intrusive. This gadfly here to my left of American education has done it in perhaps the toughest state in the union for education reform, which is the state of Michigan, birthplace of the National Education Association, just to give you one part of the pedigree of the state of Michigan. But Dick has gone into the teeth of educational bureaucracy and the real education reactionaries, and has put one proposal after another forward to improve the education of Michigan's children and America's children. He is smart, he is energetic, and he is properly ambitious. By that I mean ambitious for wider ends, ambitious for the ends of America's children, their country, and the best education of those children in this country. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our friend, your friend, Dick DeVos.
Thank you, Bill, for your very kind words. And Ed, I'm honored to be able to be here, and I'm honored that you would take a little bit of time out of your day to listen to a business guy volunteer talk about education when there are so many in this room who have done so much more than I would ever think of doing for this effort. I feel sometimes in education that if you come from a business background that you are immediately discounted, and so I hope that I will not suffer the same discount from this group that I experienced when I was on the State Board of Education in Michigan, where I would occasionally speak to an issue from a businessman's perspective, only to be looked at as though somehow I were speaking a foreign language in the midst of the education establishment. But I did my best there, and having left the State Board, have continued to be a volunteer in this effort. Just in terms of my involvement, let me just clarify that a bit, and we'll talk. I want to talk a little bit this morning, actually a fair bit, about Michigan and what we've done in Michigan as an interesting model that might be of interest for others as we look at where the next steps may be for this movement to go forward. Having been active in education issues and reform, I was running for the State Board of Education in 1990, when I would say to people that I was both pro-life and pro-choice. What they didn't know was that I was changing issues in the middle of the statement, and they didn't know what the pro-choice stood for. Today, the lexicon has changed in America, and when we speak of education choice and education options, people actually have some idea of what that is. I think that is tremendous, tremendous progress. When the opportunity came up in Michigan to become involved and actually do something tangible about the issue, my wife Betsy and I were pleased to be able to do that. And we took over leadership of an organization called the Education Freedom Fund, which was providing then just beginning, and Bill, you were there, I think, to present some of the initial scholarships. There were, the first year, 3 scholarships were offered, privately funded scholarships. Today, Education Freedom Fund, that I continue to chair, has brought to Michigan over 4,000 scholarships, and currently still manages over 1,500 scholarships privately funded for kids in partnership with the Children's Scholarship Fund out of New York. And so rather than just talk about how can we change the system, I think it's important for all of us to also do something tangible right now for those who are looking for options and choices. And my hat's off to Teddy Forsman and to John Walton for the tremendous commitment that they have given to make a tangible and meaningful difference today. And as these children are moving through a process that is failing them and at least giving them some hope for the future. Let me just share with you, if I might, a reminder of why it is that I came to this party in the first place and the kind of concern that I have. I think you may have all seen just 2 reminders recently. You may have all seen and I'm not want to quote the United Nations for much of anything, but when they happen to agree with my point of view, I'll be happy to quote them liberally. And in this case, you may have seen the report, the United Nations Study on Education Systems, that ranked the United States 18 out of the 24 most prosperous nations of the world, South Korea, Japan leading the list. I'll take you back to Michigan. And this, to me, it comes home to me, and I hope maybe it comes home to you in a very unfortunate way. Wayne State University study was released, and I'm quoting primarily from editorial of the Detroit News that was extremely sobering. It found that in the city of Detroit, nearby to where I live, 47% of Detroiters, nearly 1 out of 2, are functionally illiterate. That ranges from those who can't read to those who could read, could at least write their names and possibly locate the expiration date on their driver's license. They are not capable, however, of filling out an application form for Social Security, writing a letter, or reading the instructions on a bottle of medicine. It goes on to make an interesting correlation that in the city of Detroit, the same city, the number of working-age men and women employed or actively seeking jobs in Detroit was 56%. That leaves 44% of Detroiters between the ages of 16 and 30 jobless and not seeking work. Now, I find the correlation to be maybe not statistically correct for those statisticians in the crowd, but for someone like me, I see two numbers like that, and I cannot help but believe that if you can't read, that you're probably somewhat dissuaded from applying for a job and having to fill out an application that you're feeling yourself completely incompetent to deal with. Now, where does this rank Detroit? Let's just put ourselves, because Detroit doesn't compete against Grand Rapids or against Washington. We certainly compete in a global environment today. And where does this put Detroit in terms of illiteracy? Detroit at 47%, remember. Croatia has an illiteracy rate of 1.7%. Vietnam, 6.7%. Thailand, 4.4%. India, 44.2%. And so that puts Detroit on par roughly with the country of Zimbabwe, which has approximately the same literacy rate. I would just note that I am thankful that the world does not hold our education system as a measure of our freedom and of the success of our society. The Cuban illiteracy rate is just less than 2%. Now, this is a staggering and frightening and troubling issue for all of us. And it ought to be, because we as a community cannot expect to continue, can we, if segments of our own society are struggling in this way. For many of us, it's not a personal matter. When my wife and I led the voucher effort in Michigan a few years ago, which was soundly defeated, but the effort was defeated, but we were not. We continued to speak to it, not because it was going to make a whit's worth of difference for our children. Our children were just fine, thank you. We happen to live in a great school district, and we have access to great alternatives. But our fight was for those in the city of Detroit. And that is why we continue, and that's why I continue to be involved with this. There is a tremendous injustice. Now, progress to date, I already said that education choice is now a part of our lexicon. I'm pleased to see that. Thanks to the Children's Scholarship Fund, 50,000 kids are able to attend their own school, the school of their choice, through scholarship programs. We've made tremendous progress in charter school opportunities and charter school options nationally today. There's, in fact, one of the fastest growing, and it was recently reported in business publications as one of the fastest growing companies without its educational connection, was National Heritage Academies, which happens to be headquartered literally within a stone's throw of my home in West Michigan, who are expanding their charter school efforts, and not only in Michigan, other places. There are other excellent organizations in the charter school arena, both in the physical charter schools as well as those that are moving on the internet and are operating virtual charter school academies today. We have successful programs in Milwaukee and Cleveland. We have a tremendous programs underway in Florida, which became, as you will recall, the center of the gubernatorial election campaign in Florida, was all around education policy. And today there's a number of programs. The most widely known program with regard to the school grading system has 600 students who are able to receive vouchers under that program. Under the McKay program, which interestingly is not means tested for special education, special needs students, 9,000 kids, and the tax credit program could affect as many as 16,000. So tremendous progress in Florida, not without challenge and difficulty, but progress nonetheless. We've been, thanks to the good work of many in this room, including my friend Jim Bopp and others, the constitutional issues have become far clearer, and that has gone away. At least one of the constitutional questions has gone away as an issue and a restriction for us. And the only argument that seems to be left for the public school establishment is that it hurts public schools, that somehow school choice hurts public schools. Now, we obviously would all take a contrary view to that statement, but that's really the basis now of the argument. And I try to come back to that question about hurting public schools with the question of what is the purpose of schools, of a school today. Because if the purpose is to educate children, how can we hurt it any more than it's already hurting? And if the purpose of schools is to provide employment security for teachers and other administrators, then that pretty much defines the priority of a system that ought to die, because it's not serving our children. Well, what's next? Statistics, unfortunately, have not been compelling enough to move our effort forward at the pace that we need. Scholarships, as noble and as worthy as they have been, have not generated the same kind of support. In fact, have allowed for some to argue that, well, why doesn't the private sector just take care of all of it? Why don't you just offer scholarships to everybody who wants them, and then just get off the back of public school reform? And so it's a noble effort, but has not been enough to prompt reform. Parental demonstrations and standing on the street corners and on Capitol steps has not prompted sufficient reform. Certainly the permission of the court has not been sufficient to this point. Now, those are criticisms a little bit, but we've got work to do, and the effort, as Bill said, is probably, and in my view, certainly now needs to move, and the focus needs to shift to the state level. There are 4 areas that I would like to suggest that we as a movement will need to focus on, and I will focus my remarks primarily around one of those 4 areas. We just simply need more publicly financed parental choice programs that function. That is the overarching goal that I have, and I think we as a movement need to have more publicly financed parental choice programs that work, that are effective. What are the 4 steps to getting there? Number 1, clarification of the Blaine Amendment. We still have court issues relating to the Blaine Amendment that are blocking us and blocking our field of play at this point, and reducing the opportunities for us, certainly in the context of the Florida voucher proposal. The Blaine Amendment challenge is creating a block. Institute for Justice is doing wonderful work, and so I'm thankful for that. Number 2, school choice. We have to continue to communicate the message that school choice works and, in fact, helps public schools. Now, let me digress for just a moment. I've used the word public schools a fair bit, and I am beginning to change my own terminology. I would encourage you to either improve on mine or adopt it. Public schools is such a misnomer today that I really hate to use it. I've begun to use the word government schools or government-run schools to describe what we used to call public schools, because it's a better descriptor of, in fact, what they are. Because a public school creates this aura that if anyone walks in off the street into a quote-unquote public school, they would be welcome. And you and I both know that in America today, unfortunately, if you don't live in the appropriate school district, you are about as welcome at a particular public school as a virus is welcome on a cruise ship. And so I wouldn't continue to use the words public school to describe what are, in fact, government-run schools today. Number 3, level. We need to target our ability at the state level to deliver rewards and consequences for legislators on school choice issues. Heretofore, we have not had, as a movement, much ability, with a few exceptions. I'll speak about Michigan in a moment, where I think they have a very excellent exception. We have not had the ability to deliver rewards and consequences to legislators, where, in fact, those opposed to education reform have been able to deliver benefits and consequences on a regular basis. As simple as it seems, it does change the nature and the scope of the debate when you're able to deliver help to your friends and consequences to those who oppose the agenda. And number 4, we must continue to strive to better coordinate the efforts among school reform groups. We have finite resources in this particular area. We can't be wasteful. We can't have lone rangers riding off. We need to be coordinated to be effective on a national basis. And let me speak specifically, if I could, to the Michigan example, and to the extent that that might be of some interest to you as a model for how this war and this battle can be fought on the state level. Michigan had an interesting environment this past election cycle due primarily to term limits, which promoted a historic turnover in both the State House and the State Senate. Now, the MEA also is very strong and is extraordinarily powerful within the political scenario of Michigan. And the Democratic Party has voted and has moved very much as a bloc in opposition to education reform. All of the union groups have lined up with the MEA, creating, as you can imagine within the context of Michigan, a very powerful bloc. The past strategies for the MEA has been to work at the primary level, and even though the Republicans have held a majority in the State Senate and the State House, the reality was that there was at the State House a swing group of Republicans that were not in favor of education reform that had been worked through and supported through the primary process by the MEA. And so while you had a Republican majority, you did not have a school choice majority, an education reform majority in the State House of Michigan. And despite repeated efforts at initiatives that were supported at the state level, the governor supported, the State House would not move. And the MEA had been very effective, quietly supporting and working through in safe Republican seats primary candidates who then were elected subsequently that were more favorable to the education status quo position. So what was done under the leadership of my wife Betsy with some political folks within Michigan was to form the Great Lakes Education Project. Great Lakes Education Project's focus was on the primary process initially, with a lesser focus on the general election process. The GLEP staff, a very small skeleton staff working out of basement offices, speaking of trying to be an underground organization and taking it all the way to the end, personally interviewed 140 candidates and would-be candidates in the process of both recruiting the best candidates for the position that would reflect education reform views, as well as those candidates in the arena to fully determine their position and fully understand their positions with regard to education reform, and to also understand their campaign organizations and strategies, and to assess their probabilities of a success at the end of the day. Now, there was previously, the House, as I mentioned, was opposed to education reform, and that was 6 Republicans who held the keys to the kingdom, if you will, voting with the Democratic bloc. That was prior to the election, where the partisan split was 58-52. currently in the Michigan House, or coming in after the first of the year. The Michigan House will be split 63-47, 63 Republican, 47 Democrat, with the anti-reform Republican group down from 6 to 2. The symbolic victory that was achieved through the defeat of a Democratic incumbent with a pro-education reform Republican. Education reform also became injected into the debate, into the public debate, both in the political process, and then subsequently that would, of course, spill over into the media. And so the focus on education reform, the discussion of education reform, reached probably new highs within the state of Michigan as candidates were forced to establish positions on education reform issues within the context of Michigan. Numerous candidates, the great thing that happened subsequently because of the electoral success, numerous candidates either credited or blamed GLEP, Great Lakes Education Project, for their win or their loss. Now, as you know, there's nothing more powerful than perception. If I had to choose between reality and perception, I'd take perception any day. And if you're perceived as being the 600-pound gorilla, don't clarify the point. Take it. And so the candidates regularly blamed Great Lakes Education or credited for their victory, and that has continued to build a culture that there are, in fact, rewards and consequences for support on education reform issues. GLEP's record specifically, in terms of candidate support and in the primary, supported 28 House candidates, 20 of whom were successful, 11 Senate candidates, 7 of whom were successful. In the general, as I indicated, the primary focus was on the primary. The general election, they supported 4 Senate candidates, 3 of whom were victorious, and 8 House candidates, 6 of whom were victorious. Another measure, another factor to the success, and again, I already spoke about Education Freedom Fund doing the scholarship program purely to help those who were looking for some support to make an education choice. GLEP operating as very much a political grassroots organization and staying very much focused on its efforts there. And then the third part of the stool was an organization called Choices for Children. Choices for Children did not engage at all in the partisan political work that GLEP was doing, but Choices for Children continued to educate the public with regard to education reform issues and the positive aspects of education reform. In fact, within the last year, they became the standard stop for the journalists as they were writing on education issues. There would virtually always, if you were watching the Michigan papers, be a comment from the MEA spokesperson or a spokesperson for a certain school district or whomever was speaking out on behalf of the education establishment side, and then virtually every time there was a comment from Choices for Children that would offer the education reform perspective. That allowed for 2 things to happen. One is it kept the Choices for Children, it kept the ideas a little bit away from the political process, and then secondarily it allowed for the political process to focus purely on its goals and objectives of dealing with the legislators and dealing at the grassroots level about winning elections. And so those were the three legs on the stool, if you will, within Michigan that offered a very successful combination. Where is the battle going to be fought for the future? In my view, it will be, and at this point it needs to be fought at the state level, utilizing vehicles such as GLEP and others nationally, but ideally these organizations must be constructed locally. They need to be constructed with individuals such as the staff we had in Michigan who were intelligent and connected with the local grassroots politics of what was going on, that had the relationships, the insights, and the political sensitivity to know what was happening. And so while those of us on a national level can give support, we need to encourage the development of these organizations on a state-by-state basis in order to be able to offer a political consequence for opposition and political reward for support of education reform issues. That has got to be the battle. It will not be as visible. And in fact, to the extent that we on the right, those of us on the conservative side of the aisle, appropriate education choice as our idea, we need to be a little bit cautious about doing that, because we have here an issue that cuts in a very interesting way across our community and can cut, properly communicated, properly constructed, can cut across a lot of historic boundaries, be they partisan, ethnic, or otherwise. And so we've got a wonderful issue that can work for Americans, but to the extent that it is appropriated or by and viewed as only a conservative idea, it will risk not getting a clear and a fair hearing in the court of public opinion. So we do need to be cautious about that. We need to be cautious about talking too much about these activities. Many of the activities and the political work that needs to go on will go on at the grassroots. It will go on quietly, and it will go on in the form that politics is done. One person at a time speaking to another person in privacy. And so these issues will not be maybe as visible or as noteworthy, but they will set a framework within states for the possibility of action on education reform issues. Where are these opportunity states? In my view, I'll just offer a few thoughts where the opportunities may lie for education reform to move forward. Certainly Florida, with the recent elections there having validated Governor Bush's position on education, and at the same time, the Florida Education Association and the National Education Association have been somewhat discredited in the political process because they poured tremendous resources into Florida and were soundly defeated. So Florida offers opportunity with the governor's leadership there for continued growth and expansion. The state of Wisconsin, the governor in Wisconsin is not in favor of education choice, but is also taking a neutral position. Good efforts in Wisconsin and the existence of a very successful Milwaukee voucher project give Wisconsin some possibilities for this debate expanding beyond Milwaukee. Texas, the environment in Texas is increasingly more conducive to education reform, certainly in the House, and a little bit narrower in the Senate, with the governor in favor of education reform, although not at this point prepared to take a leadership position. Colorado has certainly firmed up in the education reform area. Our challenge there goes back to my point 4 about better coordinated efforts amongst our reform groups. In Colorado now, it's a bit of the curse of the riches. Now that folks see that there's an opportunity, there are a number of different reform ideas flowing onto the agenda that are potentially going to be confusing, and we risk coming out with less than the very best proposal we can put forward. We need, in every one of these cases where a state enacts legislation, we have got to be disciplined to be sure that we get the very best result out and don't sell ourselves too cheaply in the political process. That's a risk that I would see in Colorado, but there's opportunity in Colorado for education reform to move forward. Maybe a possibility in Virginia in the off-year election to firm up our positions in the houses there despite the governor's opposition. South Carolina and New Hampshire are a bit unclear as to what, but there appear to be some possibilities in those states of education reform moving forward. Tier 2, Utah has some interesting opportunities. The governor, however, there is opposed. Arizona appears to be sinking into tweaking mode, tweaking their existing tax credit mechanism, which is a nice thing, but is not going to be meaningful in terms of really moving the agenda forward. Washington, D.C., I just was handed a few minutes ago the Wall Street Journal, which again editorialized with regard to Washington, D.C. and efforts here and the need for renewed efforts here in Washington. Although some of us would maybe be a little bit cynical about it because as you've all experienced, and at least my observation from outside the Beltway and from the Midwest has been that as soon as anything tries to get done here in Washington, it brings so much heat and so much fire and so much energy to a relatively small effort, that it's very possible that more could be achieved and more could be gained in terms of demonstrating the value of the education reform ideas in other states, as well as Ohio having some potential for us, given the Cleveland program, and to the extent that we can demonstrate success there within the context of Ohio, it may be a compelling argument that could be used there. So those would be my views at this point, and those are not just mine, but comments from others as to where this battle could move to. I'm saddened to say that Michigan is not one of them, despite the good efforts in Michigan to establish a very much education reform-minded state House and state Senate, having a governor now who is opposed to education reform, provides somewhat of a lockout, as well as Michigan having one of the most difficult constitutions as it relates to allowing any public funds to flow into non-public institutions. And so Michigan, sadly, having defeated the voucher initiative, which I must say was really a very good and a very well thought through proposal, unfortunately, Michigan may well move to the back of the education reform train, which as a native of Michigan, I'm saddened to say, but when the time comes, we will bring the fight back to Michigan again and do everything we can there. So I am continuing to be optimistic. I have, in the 10-plus years of involvement and discussion on the education reform initiative, I've seen tremendous progress. I would encourage us not at all to be disheartened, and that I just see that there is now continued opportunity and probably, unfortunately, greater need than ever before for education reform. We have our case, and the need has unfortunately and sadly been proven for us by the continued failure of the existing systems to meet the needs of our children. And it would be my fondest wish, as I've said publicly many times, that Education Freedom Fund, providing scholarships to parents who are unhappy with their current school and can't afford and can't get their kids anywhere else, it'd be my fondest wish that we would go out of business. It'd be my fondest wish that our efforts on education reform would become obsolete, because that our communities would adopt these ideas, embrace these ideas, move them forward, not for us, but for the benefit of children. Probably not the children of those of us sitting in this room, but the children whose lives are sadly not being served. And that is, in fact, a true American tragedy. I'd be happy to respond if there were any questions or comments or discussion that we could have as we go today.
You mentioned Blaine amendments in your speech. Can you explain to me what they are, what they do, and why they're a problem for you?
The Blaine amendments tend to be, and maybe Jim can be more articulate to this point as well, but Blaine amendments are amendments that have been adopted in a number of states which preclude public funds from flowing into institutions that would not be considered to be public institutions. And so it really precludes, under the state constitution, provides some of the same block that was argued under the United States Supreme Court, the United States Constitution that the Supreme Court recently solved. But the state constitutional questions and the Blaine amendments and their applicability is still very much in question and is presently being considered by the court. Jim, I don't know if that was an adequate layman's representation. I'm always nervous in front of lawyers. I've been trained as a businessman to always be nervous in front of lawyers. Yes, ma'am.
I'm very interested in your comment about GLEEP, because it sounds to me like it is a state.
We prefer GLEP because it's not GLEEP sound too much like bleep, and then it just sort of gets all confused.
GLEP. Sounds like a state-based, education-oriented version of the Club for Growth, which has been focused on economic issues. Is it something that can be replicated in other states, and if so, why not experiment next year? In 2003, there are 4 states that have legislative elections, and 2 of which have gubernatorial as well, but you have Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and you mentioned Virginia.
Right.
The idea of vetting candidates at the primary level, which is something that most national political organizations tend to be rather reluctant to do, so that very often you end up having to vote for somebody you don't much care for,
Exactly.
simply because they carry the party label.
Exactly.
But if you get in at the primary level, where you're really doing the kind of vetting that the Club for Growth people do at the congressional level, and working to get good people elected at that level, why wouldn't it be interesting to try that in the 4 states and play next year?
I think it would be interesting to try and answer the first comment. You've articulated the issue very nicely. I would only say that to focus our efforts, given a finite set of resources, we at this point don't have the luxury of fighting all fronts. And if we are going to focus our resources nationally, for those of us who are involved and who are concerned about education reform beyond our individual states, are concerned about it as a national effort, I think we want to focus our resources on those states where we're within the margin, where a few votes that can be affected through a successful primary-based political PAC effort can, in fact, make the difference between a state that would be opposed to, such as the case of Michigan, where we were only a few votes away. And if were it not for a constitutional problem, but setting that aside, had we had a governor that was in favor, Michigan would be an ideal example of how a few votes can make a huge difference in terms of going forward with the effort. And so I would tend to focus and would encourage us to not spread ourselves amongst every election, because while there's a few elections, we ought to be diligent about husbanding our resources and focusing on where we can really make a difference meaningfully for legislation in the relatively near future, and then rolling that out, what we learn in 2004 and the election cycle there, amongst, again, I would argue, a limited number of states where we have a higher probability of success and really bring a tremendous effort to bear as opposed to scattering our resources. The resources in this effort are not infinite, and in fact, it's a challenge to raise money for education reform. I mean, let's put it on the table. What happens, unfortunately, to the credit of our opponents, they have taken a tremendous number of our natural financial allies off the table because they've simply threatened them. The Florida case is an example of tax credits. Here's a situation in Florida where up to $50 million of corporate taxes can be flipped over into education support for kids who want to exercise an educational choice. There's no cost to the companies involved, and yet they have been working their hearts out to find enough companies who are willing to do this. And many of the companies have fallen off the side, especially after the teachers union in Florida made an example of Florida Power and Light, who were at one point, if you're not familiar with this one, but Florida Power and Light were either considering or had agreed to provide some support for this program. The teachers took all the kids, turned off all of their lights as a protest for Florida Power and Light, took all the kids out of the darkened air-conditioned classrooms in Florida, outdoors for the day as a demonstration of their opposition to Florida Power. Now, that may not seem like much to those of you in Washington who deal with protests and discussion all the time. I can tell you that scares the wits out of a business person. That is just too much. I have had a banker in Michigan say to me, as much as I support what you're doing with vouchers, if I were to sign up with your effort and that were to be known, I can't tell you how many millions of dollars in my institution would go away because they would move, the education community would move its resources that quickly. The repercussions would be swift and they'd be sure. And so those are just a few examples of how I think we need to the resources here are not unlimited, and the money is difficult, and therefore I would suggest we really need to be prudent, especially prudent in how we focus it. I don't know that we need to win on all fronts. If we win on enough fronts, we can demonstrate enough progress, we can create a momentum that will then carry us the rest of the way. It would be my hope. Yes, sir.
Sort of following up on that point, I was surprised that you didn't include an efficiency argument in support of choice. I've waded into the morass of education financing a few times, and from what I can discern, when students are given access to charter schools or private schools through voucher programs, approximately 10 to 30% less is spent in providing sort of comparable services to them, and the evidence suggests that they do at least as well, if not better, than the students remaining in public schools for whom significantly more resources are expended. Now, I understand that there's the political problem that a lot of people interpret spending more on education as caring more about education. But especially in this time of fiscal austerity at the state and local level, might it be time to really push the efficiency question, the idea that you can actually get more achievement by spending less if you do it through choice mechanisms?
Certainly that can be a component, and I would argue that that's a very compelling argument for a segment of the electorate, but that we, again, this issue is complex enough without adding complexity to it. And so I think that is a compelling proof point along the way, but that the issue that will tend to unite people is concern and care about their children and about getting a high-quality education. The fact that they can do it more efficiently is a wonderful plus, but I don't know that I would lead with that personally as a political proposition. I am fully in agreement with what you have seen, and that's been my experience as well, that efficiency would also increase substantially as well as effectiveness. But I again, let's not scatter ourselves. Let's be focused and let's be disciplined in our message and really talk about caring and concern. I also get a little bit concerned whenever we talk about efficiency, certainly for those of us on the conservative side of the aisle. When we talk about efficiency, what a lot of people read is heartless. That's what they hear. They say efficiency. Oh, okay, I know what you're trying to do. You're just trying to save money. You don't really give a rip about these kids, do you? It's all about money to you Republicans or you conservatives or whatever. And I resent that charge because, as I've spoken in a number of different instances, a speech I've given called Caring Too Much, is that it's not the fact that we don't care, it's I think we care too much to settle for less than the best solutions possible. But we don't necessarily communicate it that way all the time. This is an issue where we have a chance to put our heart where it really is. It's very much on our sleeve. A lot of us are uncomfortable with it there, maybe expressing it that way. This is an issue where I think we need to put our heart in our sleeve and wear it proudly, because as I indicated before, these are not our children that we're talking about. These are the kids who are really, who are in desperate need and who are children of our communities, and I think we can demonstrate real care and concern.
Education reform has many flavors. Michigan has charter schools. Every state of Illinois has tuition tax credits. You, of course, were very involved in a voucher effort over in Michigan. Through that experience, as well as your other expertise in this area, is there a best form for education reform to take? And what's easiest to sell? What's the most effective to sell?
I have an opinion that and this would be context of a personal opinion and based upon the experience that we had in Michigan. I happen to be still an advocate of the use of the voucher mechanism as the appropriate and the best mechanism to deliver education reform to the broadest number of children the most effectively. There's a part of me that, of course, likes the idea of tax credits because it reduces the risk of any potential government intervention or interference. However, I do think that the voucher solution is better for a number of reasons. Number one, in Michigan, focus group work that we did in Michigan amongst voters prior to putting the issue forward, we did consider the tax credit alternative. As we did focus groups, we found that it, again, fragmented the message. The message is complicated enough without fragmenting it. As soon as we got into tax credit discussions in Michigan, immediately the discussion amongst the focus groups went from education reform to who gets the tax benefit. Why are you, oh, I know why you're doing this. Now, you can imagine for me, just imagine the politics of this one, me, in the situation that I am in, given my last name problem or whatever else I may have that's problematic, speaking to an issue that would be where there would be tax credits, where it would be immediately opined that it was personal interest and self-interest. And so you can see that some of the problems, but the biggest problem was that it got us off message of education reform, took us into a discussion about who's going to get the benefit from the tax credit. So I think there's a communication issue. The secondary problem that we've seen in Florida, again, the issue there with regard to the business people in Florida and the resource issues, is that when we adopt a tax credit, we're taking on two issues. We're not only taking on the issue of helping children with education reform, but we are now then embarking on an adventure to try to raise the funds and persuade individuals and organizations to be a part of this effort as well. So we have to work both the funding side as well as the distribution and the policy side, if you will. That adds complexity to the case. So I happen to be in favor of mechanisms that utilize vouchers, and that represents a better solution for us to proceed. Now, that is a personal opinion. There's still disagreement within education reform, and certainly that may change based upon each state's dynamics and the politics of each state. I would caution, however, for folks to immediately preclude that or to conclude that because of the lack of success for vouchers in Michigan, that somehow, well, vouchers are now dead and we have to go to that tax credits are now the new wave. I do not embrace that at all. I think tax credits would have been clobbered equally or worse within the context of Michigan due to the dynamics of the situation. So I am not at all chastened by my support for vouchers by the outcome of that election. Just about, I think we're going to need to wrap up momentarily, Ed.
Last one, maybe.
Last one, sure.
What position do you take on the strings that people will often attach to voucher programs or even tax credit programs, meaning something like the accountability standards of the local, the state, or the federal government?
I guess I take a bit of a pragmatic view with regard to that, which is that there's always a risk, and it represents a slippery slope. Given the trade-offs, I'm more willing to fight on that slippery slope because I think we end up with more results, better, more easily communicated. It is a risk area. It's one that we would have to police very definitely, and we would have to evaluate state by state as to whether the trade-off and the regulation or the requirements are appropriate to accept the program. It can get to a point, I would agree with you, if you extend your comments, that it can get to a point where the trade-off becomes unacceptable. We're having that debate now around charters in Michigan, where there is a proposal to put forward an expansion of charters, a very slow expansion with a meaningful increase in regulation. And there are many there, myself included, that argue in that case it's not worth the trade-off. But that's going to be a matter of developing the political environment and developing the legislative environment to where you've got people of strength who will be able to speak with clarity to these issues and to help to protect us. It is a risk area, however, to be sure. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dick, for sharing your insights with all of us from the real battleground on this very important issue as we look forward to battling on your side, not only in Michigan but elsewhere around the country. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. This meeting's adjourned. Mr. Secretary.